Hello and welcome to this Affinity Creative session. My name is James Ritson and I'm the product expert for Affinity Photo. Today we're going to be looking at various compositing techniques we can use in Affinity Photo to produce imagery like this. Now, I love compositing and I typically produce more fantastical or outlandish imagery, but today I want to kind of dial it back a little bit and focus more on specific techniques and how to achieve non-destructive editing from start to finish. So for example, this is a version that I worked up earlier, and you can see all of my layer work here. I can actually just turn all of this off to get back to the original image that I started with. So the entire process is non-destructive. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to close this example down and start with my base image here. So first of all, I'm going to cut out the foreground so that I can replace the sky. To do that, I will use the selection brush tool located here. And I'm just going to increase the brush width like so, or we can use left and right bracket and just brush in very quickly to the foreground detail here. Now, a useful technique that I use all the time is quick masking. So if you press Q on your keyboard, or you can toggle it up here, you go into quick mask mode, and the background areas, that is areas not included in the selection, have an overlay. So we can clearly see which areas we've currently missed from our active selection, and we can just go in and correct that very quickly and easily. I'm not too worried about micro detail because we're also going to refine the selection and the matting will pick that up. So come out of quick mask mode. Down here I've got some tricky areas of the tree line. So we're going to jump into selection refinement on the context toolbar here. And all I do is just drag across the areas I want to matte, like so. Okay, and I'm pretty satisfied with that result. So now we need to tackle which output option to use. And this is important, especially when we're dealing with cutouts, because selection and mask don't perform color decontamination. And what that does is it disregards the background color contribution from the mask or the cutout. And that's incredibly important with compositing and cutout work, because you don't want a colored fringe around the edges of your cutout layers. So in order to perform color decontamination, we need to choose either of these two options. I don't really need a mask, so I will choose New Layer and click Apply. And what that will do is actually give me a new layer as my cutout. And I've got my old layer here still preserved in case I need to use it for anything. So I'm going to rename this and call it Foreground 1. And then I'm going to bring in my new sky. So in my spare time, I do like to take a camera with me and shoot skies whenever I have the chance, really. It's just a great idea to build up your own image library of skies so that you can make your compositions truly unique, rather than just using stock imagery all the time. So I'm going to try one sky. Let's just drop this in and see what it looks like. Okay, I need to scale it slightly, so V for the move tool. Just going to scale that like so, and then I need to move it underneath the foreground layer. So one option for this is to just click drag it underneath. Okay, that will work. Alternatively, I prefer to use keyboard shortcuts quite frequently, so I can use Command left square bracket on Mac. And let's just position this up here. Now, the other thing that we're going to tackle at this point is the actual aspect ratio of the composition. I don't really like the sort of extreme landscape aspect ratio here. So because I've got all of this extra sky information just hiding outside of my current canvas, I can actually use the crop tool, so that's C on the keyboard, and just bring that all the way up. So I end up with more of like a square aspect ratio composition. I can just hit return to commit that. And there we go, we've got loads of nice sky detail now. Okay, so the other thing that we need to tackle is tonal blending. Obviously this sky does not look at all like it belongs in this scene. So one very quick way to fix that is to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. Okay, we'll just add that above our sky. And then I reckon all I need to do here is just bring the brightness up and probably just increase the contrast slightly as well. There we go. Now, another useful technique I use all the time, especially when trying to tonal blend layers together, is to actually zoom out. Because when you're working at this kind of zoom level, your eyes are only kind of really focused on one particular location or one zone at a time. Whereas when you're tonal blending, you kind of want to blend for the overall scene, if that makes sense. So by zooming out, it means your eyes can just focus on the whole composition, and then you can tweak accordingly and just get an idea of how that is affecting the entire scene. Okay, I think I'm happy with that. So let's just fit to screen. Okay, now one other thing we need to tackle is the direction of the lighting. So you'll notice with our foreground image here, the light is kind of coming off from the right. You can see the sun hitting here and the shadows being cast. So our sky is clearly contradicting this. This sky looks like the light source is coming from over here. We just need to flip the sky basically. So we select the sky. This is important. Have the move tool selected. Then we can either go to arrange and flip horizontal, or my preferred method is just to right click, transform, flip horizontal. Again, it's entirely dependent on your preference really. Both do the same thing, and now this scene looks more correct in terms of lighting. However, down here, the tonality of the sky doesn't quite match the tree line. So another useful little technique is to use a fill layer with a blend mode on it. Fill layers are non-destructive vector layers, which means you can add a gradient fill, and then you can go back and change that at any time. So let's go to Layer, New Fill Layer. And we're just going to drag to create our gradient. Just hold Shift to constrain it here. Let's go like that. Okay, now we need to set the blend mode to screen. And I think I need to reverse these two stops. Yes, I do. So we can reverse the gradient stop just by using this option up here. And now this node wants to be pure black. And then this node down here, we're going to, it might work with pure white, but now we're just blowing out all the detail. So we're just going to move this slider down like so until we start to reveal the sky detail again. So let's zoom right in and just bring this up until we get a nicer match between the foreground and the sky. We don't want to lose the sky detail completely. We just want to make it look like there's kind of like a white glow coming up off the horizon so that it matches the scene. Okay, you know what? While I'm here, I might try another sky and give myself a couple of options for later on. So I will select these layers, just hold Shift, select them all and group them. Let's call this Sky 1. Let's just go back out and grab a second sky. Okay. Just position this in place like so. And again, let's do some tonal blending. So I like to use my custom keyboard shortcuts quite frequently. You can create your own shortcuts by going to the Preferences menu. And then if I just come out of here, you'll have this category list. Just select keyboard shortcuts. And all of these options here pertain to the top menu options. So for example, if you wanted to create a shortcut for the brightness and contrast adjustment, you could go to Layer, and then down here you'll find all of the adjustment layers, and you'll see I've made a shortcut for this on Option B. So I just use Option B to add my brightness and contrast adjustment. I'm going to push the brightness up, add a little bit of contrast as well. That might actually be too much for this scene, maybe. I don't know. Let's see. We'll just zoom out again, use this little technique to kind of gauge where those sliders should be. Okay, that looks about right. And then I will group these two and call them Sky 2. Okay, I'll turn this off for now. We'll go back to our original sky, but it just means that later on in the composition, or perhaps at the very end, I can just quickly swap the sky and see how I feel about a different sky instead. So now what we need to do is I'm going to bring in some different foreground detail. Okay, I want more of like a forestry or a wooded look to the image. So I've picked out another suitable image for this. So that's our starting image, and then this one here has more of a tree line. So we'll just drop this in like so over the top. V for the move tool to position it. Now here's another useful little technique. If we just turn this layer off, essentially I kind of want the curvature, like where the tree lines go, to match between these two images. But also I want to get rid of these buildings here and also these coloured trees over here. So if I turn this layer back on, we can very quickly use number keys to change the opacity of the current layer. So if I use 5, that gets me down to 50% opacity. And then what this enables me to do is just, you see here, I can position this so that that tree line, which I'm going to use, sits above the buildings and these trees here as well. Okay, that looks good. But as a result, I do need to crop off some of the bottom here. So C for the crop tool, just bring that up like so, and then hit return. Okay, now 0 to get back to 100% opacity for this layer. I am going to add an empty mask down here. So to do that, we hold Alt or Option whilst we add a mask. Okay, so that mask is now completely inverted, and we can use B to get the paintbrush tool, just increase my width, and up here I want to set my current color to pure white, which means I can just quickly paint in like so over those areas. Okay, now I've gone too far. I've started to paint in some of the sky here. Not a problem. We can just toggle over to black using X on the keyboard and then just subtract away from these areas. Okay, looking good so far, but we do need to do some tonal blending here. And this brings me to another keyboard shortcut that I've set up and I use quite frequently. So if I add my brightness and contrast adjustment layer, it gets added as a parent layer. And then if we wanted to clip it to a particular layer, we would just offer it to the layer over to the right, like so, and drop it in. And that's fine. But I wanted to speed this process up. So what I did instead was, in my keyboard shortcuts, I went to the Arrange option. And down at the bottom here, you've got Insertion Inside. And I just made a shortcut of Shift-I for this. So now what I can do without touching my mouse at all is I just have the layer selected, then I go Shift-I, Option B. And it drops my adjustment straight in there, ready to manipulate. And of course, it's clipped to just that layer. Once again, I will zoom out just to make sure I have the correct tonal blending. I think that looks pretty good. But again, this is the beauty of non-destructive editing. You know, if it doesn't quite look right, it's not a big deal. We can just go in and modify it, even when we've done more layer work on top of it. Now, the other thing we have is some buildings down here. I'm going to in-paint these, which means basically remove them and replace them with surrounding content. But I'm also going to do this non-destructively. So I will create a new pixel layer using this option down here. I'm going to move it underneath the brightness and contrast adjustment layer. And then I'm going to get the in-painting brush tool, set the sampler to current layer and below, increase the brush width, and just paint in like so. Just go over some duplicate areas. If we don't get the result we want first time around, that's fine. And then down here, I've got some little lights and road signs that I want to remove. So we'll do that too. This is kind of minute detail. I don't think anyone would ever see this unless they were scrutinizing the image. But nevertheless, we will remove it because we're perfectionists, right? Okay. But because I've done that on a separate pixel layer, I can just Alt-click or Option-click and isolate that layer. You can see on an alpha background, there is my in-painting work. And this just means that, you know, at a later date, if we wanted to change something with the layers underneath or even something on this layer, you know, that content is just added non-destructively and the brightness and contrast is blending on top of it. So if we did want to change the brightness and contrast, we don't have to go and redo the in-painting work. And of course, if we decide that the in-painting wasn't quite right, we can just have another go. We haven't actually done anything destructively to this layer at all. Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at then is I'm going to put another composite element into the scene to give it some interest. So what I did was, from a different photo bash imagery pack, I found this rect plane that looks quite nice. So I'm going to open this as a separate document. To do that, we just, rather than offer it to the document, we offer it to an area of the interface, like so. Then I'll get the selection brush tool, just use a nice big brush for the bulk of the selection, and then just paint in to these areas. Oh, just hold Alt or Option to subtract there, like so. I think, you know what, I'll use quick masking mode. This is going to give me a clearer idea of exactly what is in my selection. Selecting is sometimes tricky, especially with JPEGs, where you might have even things like compression artifacts or noise. It's not always the easiest process, but thankfully, combination of quick masking and using a small brush width for the selection brush, 9 out of 10 times, it's a pretty easy solution. Okay, I'm going to refine this, so jump into Selection Refinement up here. We're just going to matte all of these areas because we've got quite a lot of sky detail that shows through the fuselage and other areas, like so. Got some down here as well. I'm not too worried about the, although having said that, there are a pair of legs there. Let's subtract them. There we go. Let's just see if we can matte that as well. But I'm not too worried about the accuracy of the foreground because we're going to be masking that out anyway. You'll see in due course. But these areas are important just to tackle because it's kind of like a bit of an ordeal to do them manually. Okay, so once again, we want color decontamination. I'll just sort out this area here. Actually, sorry, I've seen some little holes here as well. There we go. Okay, right, I'm going to stop now. So we want color decontamination again, so we need to select new layer, click apply. Okay, and then we'll just copy that pixel layer. So Command C or Control C on Windows, paste it into our main composite document. V for the move tool, move that into place, scale it down. You can hold Command on Mac, Control on Windows to scale around the center. We're going to put it sort of in our scene roughly here. Now, in terms of scale, I'm not going for realistic scale because ultimately, you know, this scene is going to be viewed perhaps on Instagram, something like that, on, you know, some small devices. So we kind of want our areas of interest to stand out. So we don't want to make the plane, you know, this small, even though it's not very realistic. We're not going for full-on realism here, photorealism. We kind of, you know, we want to make a big deal of this, this element that we've put in our scene. So I'll stick with this for now, but I may revise the scale later. I don't know yet. But the other thing we need to do is do some textured masking. So let's just rename this actually. Let's call this crashed plane. I'm going to add a mask layer. B for the brush tool. But this is the problem. We have a soft round brush at the moment. And if I just brush in here, it just doesn't look very good because you can kind of see like semi-transparent pixels of the foliage here. And yeah, it doesn't work. So we're going to undo that and instead go across to the brushes panel. Now there's a masking category that ships with Affinity Photo. We're going to use that. And down here, we've got a couple of textured brushes. So I'm going to use this first one. Just make sure my color is set to black, I believe, to subtract. Yep, there we go. And because it's a textured nozzle, it kind of, the brush strokes are randomized as well. So you get this nice textural approach to masking. I'm just going to zoom in so you can really see this. So as I just brush across the foreground detail here, what this is doing is kind of helping to bury the plane into the trees. So it looks like it's actually kind of, in between all of the tree detail. And I think I'll just go a little bit higher. Okay, that's looking like a good starting point. So just before and after, there we go, that looks significantly better. Now let's look at blending this in tonally. So I'm actually going to talk through several different techniques that you can use. You can use just one of them, but I'm actually going to combine them. So the first is, of course, what I've done before, which is use adjustment layers for tonal blending. So Shift-I, Option-B, to put a brightness and contrast adjustment inside the plane layer. And then we can just perhaps, I'll zoom out again, make the contrast match this scene. Let's see, do we decrease or increase? Perhaps we decrease. Oh no, maybe we just leave it, maybe a slight increase. It's sometimes difficult, But again, that's why you can always just go back and revisit it, especially when you start adding more adjustment layers on top of your composite layer work. It might reveal tonal discrepancies that you wouldn't have seen before. So there's absolutely no harm and no shame in leaving it as it is now and then going back if it doesn't look quite right. Now the next thing I will do is add a white balance adjustment. Okay, this plane looks too cool for the surrounding temperature of the scene, so we can add a white balance adjustment. I actually made a shortcut for this, so I use Option W, which I will use now. Okay, and that's above the brightness contrast, and we just add a little bit of warmth to the plane, and perhaps a little bit of tint as well. Okay, so that's starting to look a little bit more like it matches. And the other thing we can do is some brushwork. So I will create a new pixel layer, but actually I'll use rather than just this option down here, I'll use the shortcut. So Shift Command N on Mac, Shift Control N on Windows. Get the paintbrush tool. Don't forget that we've got a textured brush, so we need to go back to our brushes panel. I'm just going to choose a nice soft round brush from the masking category. Okay, and what I'm going to do is color pick, so Option or Alt, click and drag, and I'm going to choose a surrounding, let's sort of like have a drab olive type color, and I'm just going to brush around the edges here. So what we're going to do is just get the brush strokes in place. In fact, I'm going to undo this and instead color pick from another color down here. Okay, I'm going to paint in here. So what we're doing is just getting the brush strokes down, and then we're going to use a blend mode. So we could, for example, try multiply. That's far too strong at 100% opacity. So with the pixel layer selected, I could press 5 and perhaps try 50%. Let's see what that looks like before, after. Not too bad. Let's try overlay, which will bring through a bit more of the kind of highlight intensity. 100%, what does that look like? Perhaps that's too strong. Or it might actually be... Okay, let's try 75 to get numbers in between multiples of so 10, 20, 30, for example. You can just type numbers in quick succession. So if you wanted to say 35, type 35. I think we'll go for 75%. Yeah, that looks about right. Now the other technique is a little bit more involved, and we're going to use channels. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment. That's Command M on Mac, Control M on Windows. And on the channels panel here, what we want to do is isolate the composite red, green, and then blue channels. Now notice that the blue channel, in contrast to red and green, that's dramatically different. The contrast just does not match at all. So what we can do is change our channel target here to blue. And then to try and match this contrast, I reckon what we need to do is bring this up here. So these are the black tones, or the shadow tones. And then add another node perhaps here and drag it down. Okay, yeah, that looks nice. So we've now made the contrast of the blue channel from the plane match more closely to the foreground. But when we reset to get all of our channels back here, you'll notice the plane now looks too green. It's kind of lost its unique individual color. So what we need to do is go back to green and red and kind of do the same thing, but not match the blue curve entirely. We're just kind of going to move these around like so until we get a nice bit of red in there. Not too much, but just enough to kind of make it stand out a little bit and make the plane look less chameleonic, like it's suddenly taken on all of the colours around it. Okay, I think that will do. The final thing is lighting. So we've got our light source coming from over here, and the plane kind of had some kind of, in fact, let's go back and have a look at it, the original image. Yeah, okay, so the plane is backlit. So it's kind of like soft and diffused around the front here. So what we actually need to do, I'll just close this down now, is add some like rim lighting over here. So new pixel layer, B for the brush tool. I've got my soft round brush. I want a white color. I'll set the blend mode to overlay. And then I'm just going to paint in across the top here like so. And actually, yeah, I think I can stick with 100% opacity for that. That doesn't look too bad. And it just kind of brings it out of the scene a little bit, makes it pop slightly. Okay, so the next thing we will do is a bit of creative brushwork to add some color to this image. So I'm going to, on top of all of these layers, add another empty pixel layer. Get the brush tool, and let's just resize that a little bit. Set the blend mode to overlay. Drop the opacity down to maybe something like 20%. And I'm just going to paint into this area. So this is kind of like my non-destructive dodging and burning, I guess. So we're going to add a nice bit of highlight here, and then use X, switch to pure black, and just paint down here to darken the foreground. So now, if I zoom out and turn this layer off, you'll see the before and the after. So you probably wouldn't spot it if you were looking at the finished image, but that's just a nice, I call it like a redirection of light. Just bringing the viewer's attention to the areas you want to focus on, and kind of just bringing other areas less focused, basically. Making them so that you pay less attention to them. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is add another pixel layer. Get the brush tool again, and we're going to set the blend mode to reflect. So I was thinking of a catchy name for this, but I couldn't really come up with one. So I guess something like color separation. Basically, we're going to add some artificial color to the background areas and the foreground areas to kind of separate them a bit more tonally. So what we might do is pick like a sort of an olive color and then just paint into the foreground here. This is far too strong, but don't worry, we can just tweak the opacity. Okay, so that's our olive. And then on a separate pixel layer, so just create a new pixel layer using this option here, reflect 20% again, and we'll go for like a reddish orange and just paint that into the background detail. We just zoom in here, up here. Okay, this is looking a bit garish at the moment, but don't worry, we'll sort that out by tweaking the opacity. Okay, so then let's select these two layers. They're both at 20% opacity. Let's use 1 on the keyboard to drop them down to 10%. Okay, that looks a little better. And all this does really is just add some, like a subtle dash of color to those areas and just helps to, separate them tonally a little bit as well. Okay, what else shall we do then? Let's think. I believe we could use a gradient map adjustment actually. So again, this kind of, this is just another one of many techniques that you can use. I'm going to use a gradient map to remap the colors of the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So for the shadows, we're going to choose like a dull orange, so somewhat down here. For the midtones, perhaps a brighter reddish orange color, slightly desaturated. And then for the highlights, like quite a bright cyan. Then we'll close that down and change the blend mode of this to overlay. This effect is far too strong and it looks hideous. So we'll try a low opacity. Let's try 20%. And again, we'll just turn this off so we can see the before and the after. So this adds a nice splash of color to the scene as well. Okay. Now the next thing I think I will do at this point is add another set of composite elements. So go back out to Finder. I've got they come from a photo bash pack called Crows and Ravens. So I've shortlisted 3 here and I'm just going to drag them in, all 3 of them at the same time, drop them into my document like so. V for the move tool, and I'm just going to scale them down. I've got multiple layers selected, which means the aspect ratio does not constrain by default. So just hold Shift to do that, and then Command on Mac, Control on Windows to resize around the center. Okay, let's sort of position them roughly here. And then I'm going to move them to have some kind of like triangular formation. I'll scale this one down slightly as well, like so. Okay, so how do I feel about that? Perhaps they're a bit too high. Rather than having to select all of the layers all together, it's actually easier to select them, group them, just give this name of birds and use V, and then I can just move the group around like so. It also makes it easier if I want to add some kind of effect or tonal blending. So for example, I could use Shift-I, Option-B, and then drag the contrast down, perhaps increase the brightness slightly. And then as well as that, I might add some motion blur. So I can use a live filter layer to achieve this. So with the group selected, layer, new live filter layer, blur, motion blur. Then I can just drag to determine the level of motion blur and the direction. That's far too strong, so we'll just take the radius down until we get a nice amount of blur. There we go, that looks about right. Okay, So, what am I thinking at this point then? I think I will change the composition slightly. I want the viewer's eye to focus more on the crashed plane and the birds. So to do this, I need to crop off any kind of redundant detail from the foreground. So C for the crop tool, and I'm just going to bring the crop handles in either side and produce an image that has more of a square aspect ratio. Let's try that. Yeah, okay, I think that works for now. Yeah. Okay, so we've got all of our composite elements. Let's add some lens flare. Why not? Let's add some lens flare. So I'll go back out to Finder. Here is my lens flare that I picked earlier. We will drop this in over the top. In fact, I'm going to turn the birds off because it's going to help me see the rest of the composition more easily. So now I need to scale this up. I also need to flip it. So right click, transform, flip horizontal. Okay. To match the direction of the sun. Bring that even further like so. Just hide that slightly off screen. Then set the blend mode to screen. Okay. Now here's another little blending technique. This lens flare, it's adding a nice effect actually. In fact, I really like this, the tonality of it. The way it's affecting some of the background detail in the foreground here. But the problem is that you can barely see it up here, and I want some more of that to show through. So we want to reduce the contrast of the composition before the lens flare gets composited. So underneath it, we will add a brightness contrast adjustment, bring the contrast all the way to the left, then above it, add another brightness and contrast adjustment, and bring the contrast back a little bit, like so, and perhaps reduce the brightness slightly as well. Okay, so that's helping to expose more of the lens flare detail up here. Let me just show you what happens if we don't use these two adjustment layers. So you can see we're actually bringing through a bit more of the lens flare detail. It's quite subtle, but it's these little differences that kind of make the overall image. Okay. I think this is looking pretty good. What I might do, just to finish this off, is perhaps just some more work on the colours and so on. So we have a number of ways in which we can tweak the colours. One of my personal favourites is Selective Color. Okay, and what it enables you to do, and I use this all the time, is add a colour cast to the whites, neutrals or blacks in the image. So for example, if I select blacks and then reduce the yellow contribution, you can see here we can add a nice blue colour cast to the shadow detail. Obviously this is too strong, so we just need to take that back. But if I just bring it down a little bit, you can see I add this nice little blue tinge to the detail down here. And I really like being able to make all these little subtle changes. The other thing we might do is go to the yellows. This image, or this composite, comprises quite a few yellow tones, as you can see. And we might reduce the yellow contribution and perhaps reduce magenta as well. And that gives us more of a lush green look to all of the trees and the foliage down here. Okay, maybe try not to overdo that too much. But I don't know, I can't make my mind up. I love experimenting with tonality and color because, I mean, objectively you might disagree, but I don't think there's any wrong approach. And sometimes what I like to do is just go back and revisit old images and just try a different combination of adjustment layers just to mess around with the colors. And, you know, sometimes it's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse, but that's, again, the beauty of non-destructive editing, is that you can just make these decisions on the fly. You can revisit really old work, and perhaps with a fresh mindset, you can just revisit it and, you know, make it look more unique or improve it. Okay, I might, for example, add an HSL adjustment, perhaps increase the red color contribution, although that's probably a little bit overkill. maybe just a little increase there, and perhaps increase the saturation on the yellows as well. There we go. Okay. One final thing before I bring the birds back in. I've been looking at this for a while. I'm not happy with the blending of the plane here, so I'm going to go right down to the crash plane, revisit that mask layer, get my brush tool, select that textured brush, make sure I'm set to pure black, and just subtract away from these areas down here. And also, this was my mistake. I think I missed out. Oh no, I didn't actually. This isn't part of the background. It's part of the plane, but it's too visually distracting for me. So I'm going to remove it. There we go. I think I'm happy with that now. Yeah, okay. That looks better. The final thing is I might just turn off that curves adjustment, see if I prefer it with the contrast adjustment. I do, but there's perhaps too much red, so we just need to go back into red and tweak that slider, or tweak that node, sorry, until we're happy with the tonality. There we go. Okay, I think I'm pretty much done. Let's turn on the birds again. There we go. We've got our birds up there. And then I'll just zoom out, see how I feel about this, about the overall contrast of it. If I want to quickly adjust the contrast, I might add a final brightness and contrast adjustment and just move the contrast slider. And this is the great thing. I kind of, when I was working this up, you know, to prepare for this session, I went with a quite punchy, contrasty look. But then I visited some other works from artists that I follow online, and then I kind of grew in love, you know, I grew in love with the kind of like the matte look where you don't have any kind of like true blacks in your image. And so then I thought, well, maybe I want to try that as well. And ultimately, you know what? I can't decide. So I'll tell you what, I will leave the deciding vote to you, the viewers. So do you prefer it with more of a kind of like less contrast, matte look? Or should I go for a punchier, more contrasty look? It's up to you. So that about sums it up. I appreciate this probably isn't like the most exciting composite to produce. It's not very fantastical. I suppose it is a little bit, but not like some of the work I produced. But I really, you know, it was the kind of like the project that had a great mix of techniques that I really wanted to get across to you all. You know, especially in terms of tonal blending, how to clip layers, clipping adjustment layers into pixel layers for tonal blending, that type of thing, and just how to do the whole thing non-destructively. So I hope all of these techniques you found really helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and take care, all of you. Thank you.